Hi guys, it's Dylan from Bijou Diamond Jewellery in London again with another watch review, and today we're looking at a comparison between the Royal Oak Offshore 42mm versus the Royal Oak Offshore 44mm. If you haven't seen our individual reviews of both of these watches, then go check those out because they'll give you a more in-depth look at each piece. This one's going to be more sort of like an overview of the differences and how it feels when you wear it. Let's start with some history behind the Audemars Piguet Royal Oak itself. So the Royal Oak is much smaller than this watch. I'll put a picture on the screen now of the original Royal Oak, which was released in 1972. Audemars Piguet released the Royal Oak because their sales were down and they weren't doing so well. They needed a brand new model that was going to make them unique to the rest of the brands and put them back in the game again. The original Royal Oak was the world's first steel sports watch to feature super high-end luxury finishing like a dress watch. So the Royal Oak gets its name from an old naval ship, and the reason why they named it after a naval ship is because Gerald Genter designed a watch, specifically the bezel, to look like a ship porthole, like you're looking through the little window on a ship. And you've got those big screws in that octagonal bezel. It's a really amazing look. It reminds me a little bit of an old-fashioned diving helmet. Then moving on to 1992, which was the 20th anniversary of the Royal Oak, Audemars Piguet wanted to release a watch that kind of marked that 20th anniversary, like a celebration piece of the success the watch had had for the brand and brought them back into business. And to do that, they enlisted the help of a 22-year-old designer, so a very young designer, and they said, you need to create something for the more sporty market, people, maybe a younger audience, because the Royal Oak was quite a dressy watch. So he redesigned the Royal Oak, giving it a much chunkier case, had sort of iron casing within inside the watch, a much bigger wrist presence, and the original one, nicknamed the Beast because it was so big, actually came on a bracelet, but now most of them come on straps. You still can get them on bracelets. He also designed the watch so it was very transparent in terms of design. You can see every part of the piece. It's not quite slipped together like a Daytona is very almost a one-piece design. On the Offshore, you have that clear rubber gasket around the bezel. You know, it's got a real industrial utility look to the watch, but then when you look closer, you've got these incredible polished details and elegance about the piece. So that's a little bit of history behind the Royal Oak itself and the Royal Oak Offshore, how it came into play for Audemars Piguet. Now let's have a look at some of the similarities between the 42mm and the 44mm Royal Oak Offshores. The movement is pretty much identical on both these watches. The only difference between them is our oscillating rotor, which you can't see on the 42mm, but you can see on the 44mm thanks to that crystal caseback. The 44mm has a 22 karat white gold rotor, and that drives our movement, helps to create the energy from the movement of your wrist and translate that into power that the watch can store up and then use to tick away. Unfortunately, I can't show you the rotor on the 42mm because it has a steel case back, so we can't see in there. But that has a 22 karat yellow gold rotor with the Audemars and Piguet family crests hand carved into the rotor. Now let's have a look at the differences between these two watches, and we'll start with the clasp. On the 42mm, we have the standard Audemars Piguet deployment clasp. I used to own this 42mm, and it did really dig into my wrist sometimes towards the bottom or the hingy part of the AP logo. Now on the newer 42mm, they've got a D-buckle like we see on the 44mm here, which is actually much more comfortable. That doesn't dig in, and I feel like it conforms to your wrist much better as well because it's just all rubber. The finishing on the 42mm clasp is amazing. I love the fact that when you close it up and it's on your wrist, the only thing you see is that small tiny piece of steel with the Audemars Piguet. Very minimalistic, very simple, elegant, and kind of gives it a little bit more of a higher end, dressier look compared to the new D-buckles, I think. So on the 44mm, we've got a D-buckle which is brushed, looks really cool, very rugged looking, kind of goes with the whole rugged look of the watch, and I really like it. Feels incredibly solid. Of the two clasps, which do I prefer, I think the 44mm with the D-buckle is much more comfortable than the 42mm. So in that respect, I prefer it every day, but I think the 42mm looks a little classier and a little bit more high-end, a bit more luxury. The 44mm doesn't look very luxury in comparison. The D-buckle also will not wear out over time, whereas the 42mm can sometimes lose that click, especially on the yellow gold ones. Now if we move on to the strap of these two watches, this is one of the biggest differences between the two watches. The 44mm is much bigger. The 42mm strap tapers to a really nice thin end, and I think that makes it look a little bit more elegant and a bit less sporty, a little bit less rugged, whereas the 44mm has that real wide, big, kind of action man looking strap. One point that I have thought about between these two buckles, that's something to bear in mind, is the fact that the D buckle is actually much easier to remove than the 42mm deployment buckle. Therefore, pickpockets probably would find it much easier to try and take the 44mm watch off you. Even though it's absolutely gigantic and pretty heavy, you probably would notice it coming off your wrist. I much prefer the finish on the 44mm. I love the 42mm straps finish. It's very smooth and elegant feeling. It feels really, really nice on your wrist. Whereas the 44mm's got kind of more like a bubbly effect, a bit more rough. Definitely feels more rugged, like it would last much longer. So in that respect, I probably prefer the finish and feel of the 44mm strap, and the buckle is much more comfortable, but I think the 42mm is much more elegant, much more luxury looking and feeling as well. Now if we take a look at the actual case on both watches, the 44mm obviously is much bigger, it's 2mm wider, but it definitely looks much larger. And that's mainly to do with the pushers on the right hand side of the watch, or the crown side of the watch. The crowns on both these watches are pretty much identical, but those pushers for the stop, start and reset on the chronograph are much, much bigger on the 44mm. They're big, huge, wide buttons versus the small little mini pushers on the 42mm. And then another difference is our case backs, which we mentioned before. It's a clear crystal case back on the 44mm, so you can see the movement inside, and then on our 42mm we've got a steel case back. I love the clear crystal case back on the 44mm. I think it juxtaposes that whole rugged look of the watch when you've got that elegant, really highly finished, polished and really intricate movement inside. One of the biggest differences you'll notice between these two watches is the ceramic parts on the 44mm. And this is actually such a good addition to the Offshore, because the Offshore is big, it's a big watch, it sits very high on your wrist and it's very easy to scrape and scratch. Because it just sits so far out. Ceramic's one of the hardest materials in the world. That means it doesn't scratch very easily. And that means that when you dink it, or if you dink it, it doesn't put any marks on the watch. The owner of this watch wears this watch every day, and it looks amazing. All the polished edges on the ceramic are still perfect. The brush looks amazing on the top of the bezel, whereas on the steel, this 42mm is not worn every day, and you can see it's much more worn, and you can see the scratches on the steel shiny parts much easier, and also the brushed parts. They show up much more than on the ceramic. Now if we turn the watches to the side and have a look at the pushers and the crown, on our 42mm we've got rubber pushers and a rubber crown, which looks really nice and it feels really good. It matches the strap as well. But then if we look at the 44mm, we've got the ceramic again, this polished look, and then on the crown we've got a little bit of brush too. Again, that's going to wear much better over time. It's going to look newer for much longer, and it's probably much better when you come to resell the watches. Now if we take a look at the dials on both these watches, they're pretty similar. We've got obviously Arabic numerals on the 42mm, which I really, really like. I think that's probably one of my favorite features on that 42mm. Whereas on the 44mm, we've got that really visible tachymeter, kind of like a silvery effect on this dial. Looks really cool, works really well with the whole ceramic and steel look on the rest of the watch. The font on the subdials is different on these two watches as well. That 44mm has a much more sporty, action-looking font, whereas the 42mm has much more of an elegant, classic font. The tapisserie or waffle dial on the 44mm is much more prominent. You can see it much clearer because it's got silver. The lines show up much better on silver usually. And then the white on the 42mm on this specific version, you don't really see the waffle dial quite as much. I love the red accents on the 44mm. That's one of my favorite things about this watch. It's just kind of like adds a little bit of color and detail to the whole watch, because the watch is kind of mostly silver and black with the steel and the ceramic. So it's nice to have that sort of little detail pop out. I love the date window on the 44mm as well being black. I think that looks so cool. Of the two cases, I prefer the design with those big giant pushers on the 44mm. I do really like the simple elegance of the 42mm. When you compare the two side by side, the 42mm does look so much more elegant and classy, understated compared to the big action 44mm. So now let's kind of have a look at how they fit on the wrist. The 44mm really does splay quite far out on your wrist. It sits amazingly. It feels so comfortable on the wrist. The weight is obviously much more than the 42mm. Hugs your wrist much better, I feel, with this D buckle versus that deployment clasp. Someone who owns this watch that it looks amazing on is Tony Robbins. He has the ceramic version of this, and I think it looks amazing on him. He's got huge wrists because he's a massive guy, so it doesn't look big on him, and I think it suits him so well. The height of the watch doesn't feel too much. I think that's kind of because it's so wide and big. It's got such a huge presence on your wrist that the depth doesn't even feel that relevant. The strap is so wide as well that it kind of hides the width of the watch and the ginormousness of it. Whereas the 42mm feels much smaller, fits my wrist much better as well. Again, the lugs do splay out past my wrist, so it's still a big watch at 42mm, and it does wear much bigger than a 42mm. It wears more like a 44mm, and the 44mm here wears more like a 46mm. So again, that's kind of because it's got these big wide pushers and stuff on the side of the case. The nice thing about the 42mm is it tapers much more, feels much smaller in your wrist, it's nowhere near as heavy, and the depth on this watch feels actually much more than the 44mm. It feels like much more of a deeper watch. Again, because proportionally it's not quite as wide. Of the two, which do I prefer on my wrist? I'd love to have the 44mm, and I'd love for the 44mm to fit me, because I just think it's one of the coolest looking watches ever, especially the ceramic and carbon version. But it just is way too big for me, and I much prefer smaller watches. The 42mm here fits my wrist really nicely, but I used to own this watch, but still just feels a little bit too big for me now. When I had it, it was great. You can easily forget about this watch, whereas the 44mm, I don't know if you could forget about it. I think it's so big that it's always there in your mind. You can always see it in your peripheral vision, whereas the 42mm is smaller and fits your wrist much better. Would I own both these watches? 100%. If I had the choice between the two, I'd love to shrink the 44mm to like 40mm. I think that would be one of the coolest looking watches. If you've got big wrists, the 44mm is one of the coolest watches ever. I love the other options they offer for this in terms of gold and ceramic and carbon, etc., etc. I think it's probably one of the coolest watches AP makes, especially the novelty versions with the tourbillons. I think they're absolutely amazing, incredible pieces. The way Audemars Piguet have made a rugged watch look so amazingly high-end and luxurious, I think they've achieved a lot with both of these watches. There's much more to these watches in terms of character and incredible design versus Rolexes like the Deep Sea, kind of like a comparable watch. I much prefer what AP have done compared to what Rolex have done for the sports watches. AP is my favorite brand. I think they're amazing. Everything they do is so cool. And I love both these watches. I'd love to own both these watches. If I had to choose between the two, I'd choose the 42mm purely because it fits my wrist better and the 44mm is way too big. But if I had bigger wrists, I would love to own the 44mm. It's one of my favorite watches ever made. The 44mm has gone up much more in price than the 42mm. The 42mm has kind of stuck around the same price point and has actually lost a bit of money on its retail price, whereas the 44mm has kind of kept on creeping up with the retail price. So if you're in both these watches for an investment purpose, the 44mm here is going to be a better option. And also the good thing about the 44mm is it looks newer for longer, like I said before, because you've got that ceramic bezel, you can't see scratches, and that's where you usually see dents and scratches on the offshores because of that huge bezel. Thanks guys for watching. Let us know in the comments which one you prefer of these two, the 44mm or the 42mm. Maybe it's not the steel ones you go for, maybe it's some of the gold ones. Let us know which ones you want to see maybe reviewed of the Offshore line. Be sure to check out our website with our jewellery. We've got more jewellery coming online. Make sure you get all your Christmas presents from us.